Discussing what's taking place in the Channel, banging on about law and order. We're not afraid to do the absolute lot of it.
Yes, and if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we'll be saying it.
Make sure you're here 9:30 a.m. till 12 p.m. every single weekday right here on GB News for To The Point.
I'm Amelia Harper. This is your news at 3 o'clock. The Prime Minister will deliver a tough message on climate change at the G20 summit in Rome. Boris Johnson will say that countries causing the most global warming must be held accountable. The summit comes ahead of the COP26 Global Climate Conference in Glasgow, which starts on Monday. He'll urge leaders to follow through on their commitments to cut carbon emissions.
One thing we've got to achieve is to ensure that we keep alive the prospect of restricting the growth in the temperature of our planet to 1.5 degrees by the end of the century. That's what it's all about. If we can do that, then we stop the prospect of so much desertification. We stop the prospect of the huge geopolitical consequences of climate change.
The Prime Minister has also given an update on the Queen's health. After speaking with Her Majesty, Boris Johnson says she's in very good form and he wishes her well.
It's very important that she should follow her doctor's advice, but as you know, she's determined to be there at the cenotaph. I've no doubt that will happen. I think that we've just got to let her get on and rest. But as you know, she's very, very hard-working. She continues to be at her desk.
Meanwhile, Boris Johnson's spokesman says the Prime Minister will hold a short meeting with the French President tomorrow as tensions grow over post-Brexit fishing rights. The British government says it's working to resolve the row and issue more licences. France is threatening to block British boats from its ports and tighten checks on vessels if the dispute isn't resolved by Tuesday. Prince Andrew has unequivocally denied accusations he sexually abused Virginia Giuffre when she was 17. In a document filed to a district court in the US, the Duke of York's lawyers said the allegations are baseless and were an attempt to achieve another payday. Miss Giuffre claims she was trafficked by convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. Royal correspondent Ingrid Seward told GB News it's good the Duke is now addressing the claims.
In a nutshell, what Andrew's lawyers are saying is that, she's decided to pick Andrew because he's very high profile. They still insist that he is totally innocent. And it's a very strong case that they've put, but we still don't know exactly what's going to happen. But this is quite positive, and at last they've actually said something.
More than 1.6 million people will be invited for a coronavirus booster vaccine next week. NHS England says around 9.5 million booster invitations have already been sent out in England, and more than 6 million doses were administered in the first 6 weeks. Over half of eligible people aged over 50 and over 2/3 of people aged over 80 have received their third dose. And when in Rome, while most people are focusing on the G20 summit, the partners of the world leaders went on a special tour of the Colosseum. Carrie Johnson and Brigitte Macron were among those who took part in the event as they greeted onlookers. Heavy security surrounded the 2,000-year-old stone Roman amphitheatre. It was closed to the public. We'll have more news in half an hour and throughout the day. Goodbye.
Hello and welcome to We Need to Talk About, your weekend fix, where I pose a question that needs plenty of time for discussion. And today, we need to talk about lobbying. Democracy cannot exist in a vacuum. Its very meaning is demos, people, and kratis, power. A government must be accessible and forge open dialogues with the public, with civic society, and with industries and business, or else it becomes an authoritarian regime. And, believe it or not, we're all lobbyists. true. We can all send an email to our local MP to try to effect change. But while Mrs. Miggins is likely to receive a polite copy and paste from a junior in a constituency office in response to her concerns over a local landfill site, the multi-billion-dollar public affairs industry thrives on whining, dining and whispering in the ears of vital contacts in the corridors of power. Programmes such as The West Wing and House of Cards paint a scandal-drenched, blackmail-infused, sleaze-filled gargantuan game of chess. But the truth is often far more corporate and dull. The industry is regulated and, while indubitably sloshing in money, often has a bark worse than its bite. In some respects, it exists to justify its own existence, with junior lobbyists presenting long lists of approaches that often fail to come to fruition. The caricature of ruthless operators and dark forces frankly doesn't sit alongside the fact that a massive amount of lobbying is actually done by charities and not-for-profits who want to use influence as a force for good. But an industry that employs 14,000 people and can influence mega decisions that affect millions of citizens has a propensity to throw up newspaper headlines on a regular basis. Cash for questions, conflicts of interest, private text messages, donations for access. A worrying mosaic of machinations starts to emerge. I've seen it firsthand as a member of the European Parliament. Every day, an event, a freebie, a drinks reception, a knock at the door. The revolving door of influence in Brussels is far murkier and far more corrupt than most people realise. Yet a one-stop shop for a corporate cartel of multinationals where 30,000 lobbyists take unelected commissioners for dinners and jollies to pen regulations that favour big business at the expense of citizens and enterprises, that rips off the developing world, trapping poor countries in agrarian poverty, and that operates within the darkest shadows of geopolitics, that manipulate an entire continent. I was horrified at what I found, and believe me, not many people were actually knocking on the door of a politician who wanted out. But Brexit changed things. We now have our own big decisions to make, having taken back control, creating a bonanza for lobbyists here. Trade deals, state aid, sovereignty over regulations, independence in foreign affairs. Whitehall must be abuzz with an influx of influencers trying to influence. It's reported some MPs receive as many as 100 approaches a week. Now democracy is closer to home, can we be, and are we, any better? The pandemic shone a light on non-standard practices, exposing a thread worth pulling at for the sake of us all. Private WhatsApps and jobs for the boys, contracts for friends of the party or chums of the minister. Yes, it was a crisis and decisions had to be taken rapidly, but rules were circumvented and trust lost. In 2014, Parliament passed the Transparency of Lobbying Act, demanding statutory registration of professional lobbyists. The legislation was brought forward by none other than Prime Minister David Cameron, echoing similar efforts by Barack Obama to clean up politics. Oh boy, how has the halo slipped? Ex-Prime Ministers, top civil servants, special advisors and cabinet ministers are in immense positions of power, with a Rolodex bursting with the who's who of running everything. As a result, they're blocked from sliding into lobbying positions that can earn them millions on the basis of their ability to connect with the most powerful people in the country. But the ban lasts a mere 2 years, under the very rules Cameron himself authored. When one tracks the careers of many prominent ex-politicians or even serving ones, it is no surprise to find board memberships and advisory positions worth a few bob. But it's not just the Greensill scandal that has raised questions over the secret squirrels taking place in Westminster. Housing Minister Robert Jenrick narrowly dodged disgrace after fessing up and being forced to reverse a planning decision that would have saved a developer and Tory donor tens of millions of pounds after it was discovered he'd given money at a fundraiser where he was sat next to, yep, you guessed it. So what really does go on? Is the mythical status of corrupt lobbyists all rather overblown? And this necessary function of governance actually squeaky clean? Or is it a cesspit of cronyism, of dodgy dealings and nefarious deeds where unscrupulous industrialists play politicians like puppets? I want to know, as I'm sure you do too. Today, we really need to talk about lobbying. Let's first start with Professor Mirko Draka, who's a professor in economics at the University of Warwick. Thank you for coming on. Firstly, let's get to the nub of this. What is lobbying and how does it work?
Okay, so thanks for inviting me, Alex. So lobbying, you can think of it as the way we traditionally define it as executive contacts, right? So the strict definition of it would be some representative of a special interest who's meeting an influential member of the executive, like a politician or an important civil servant, right? So that's the kind of lobbying that we're looking at trying to regulate, that we want to measure and try and regulate, right? So you've got that type of lobbying, which is kind of meetings between important people. And then you've got an alternative thing that some people describe as lobbying, which would more be like political campaigning and propaganda, right? Which would be cases of where a special interest group runs some sort of public campaign, puts out some advertising, hires some PR people to contact journalists and so on, right? So, but what we're really interested in, Alex, is these meetings between important people, right? Which often have a lot of money behind them.
Well, exactly, and also have a tendency to throw up the odd scandal here and there. How regulated is the lobbying industry in the UK? How much does it need to be regulated, and is there corruption?
Okay, so we've got minimal regulation. So you've described some legislation that was introduced in 2014, the Lobbying Register Act. So, I think being as objective and neutral as possible as I can possibly be, I would still say that legislation is a cop-out, right? So it gives us nothing like the information that we get from the US Lobbying Disclosure Act, right? And we know that the US isn't necessarily an exemplar in terms of money in politics, right? So, for example, we don't know how much money is necessarily spent on lobbying. We don't necessarily know the names of all the different lobbyists involved, okay? We don't have enough information on meetings between important executives, between lobbyists and politicians and important civil service servants. Most importantly, like the biggest sort of omission in the current lobbying legislation is that it's not recording information about in-house lobbyists. So it's only recording information about consultants, people working for formal lobbying firms, right?
The big public affairs
cases
companies.
Like David Cameron, who was employed by Greensill, David Cameron did nothing wrong according to this lobbying register and this lobbying legislation, right? So he followed the regulations in terms of reporting his activity, okay? And I think that's the best example of how big the omissions are in kind of UK legislation, is that something that would be routinely recorded and noted in US lobbying disclosure provisions is just not recorded in UK provisions.
How much of a problem is nepotism in this industry? Jobs for mates, jobs for family, the revolving door of spads and advisors and leaving Parliament, becoming lobbyists, going back to speak to their old chums over a pint of beer. Do you think there needs to be some sort of regulation about that to ensure that, chums are sort of almost separated?
Yeah, exactly. So in the US, the way, and in other countries, the way they've tried to deal with this is through cooling off, what they call cooling off restrictions. So that would be, where you're working for a particular office. So let's say you're working as an advisor in the Treasury on issues of financial regulation. Then for 2 years after you leave your job at the Treasury as a SPAD or, some other position, you're not allowed to take a job in a particular area of work, right, to do with kind of financial regulation, right? So there's scope. I think here the simplest things, when we don't necessarily need really radical reforms to start with. The simplest things would be just to systematically record these movements of people into the private sector or other sectors after they leave politics. And then also, as part of recording those movements, you can start to introduce these sorts of cooling off restrictions.
I mean, perhaps one of the biggest conflicts of interest is that when it comes down to donors to parties and friends of parties who obviously donate to a particular party. And it's not just the one in government, it could be the opposition. But for that money, perhaps they expect a little something in return.
Yes, exactly. So that's what we would think of as the quid pro quo, right? So in terms of how we think about how lobbying works, we think about, this is in the formal academic literature, you would call this quid pro quo. I give you something, you give me something, right? In the context of political donations, the most recent example would be these kind of leading Conservative Party donors get to have lunch or dinner with Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak on a regular basis, right? And there, the quid pro quo in the case of donations is that access, right? That ability to set the agenda, right? Which is this sort of invisible force, this invisible influence, which makes it hard for us to quantify exactly what's going on, right? But the argument would be that since people are willing to pay for that access, then they can't keep on paying for that stuff without getting anything in return, any sort of influence in return. So I'd say that sort of, that back scratching that you describe, it's not so much very, transactional, crude quid pro quo, right? I think it more comes through this more subtle channel of influence, of the fact that you get to have lunch with Boris Johnson, you get to put an idea into his head, right? And if you're kind of persuasive enough and smart enough and clever enough, you can make an idea rattle around in someone's head for a long time, and it can eventually come out in policy and influence policy, right? So I think it's a lot of that, that more stereotyped, potentially cliched picture actually comes down to this more subtle thing about like access and setting the agenda, right? And that's, could be why it's sort of more insidious. It's less dramatic, but it's potentially more insidious.
I'm also joined by John McTernan, a political strategist who was political advisor to the Labour Party and the director of political operations for Tony Blair when he was Prime Minister, a man who should know a thing or two about the corridors of power. Welcome to the show, John. Why do you think there's such a dark shadow over lobbying in government? Are there issues, or actually is this sort of a mythological impression of what goes on behind the scenes?
Mainstream lobbying is a very well-regulated part of the political process, and as you said, it's done by such a wide range of organisations, from the Church of England and the Salvation Army right through to footballers like Marcus Rashford, who indulged in some quite effective lobbying of the Prime Minister over free school meals. The issues which are causing trouble at the moment are unregulated parts of it. So David Cameron faced no difficulty in being paid to be staff of Lex Greensill, and then as a paid member of staff, just contacting former colleagues and asking them to push his project on, to push on Lex Greensill's dodgy form of financing through the government system. That is something which shouldn't be allowed, and that could be quite straightforwardly changed. It's a small change to the register. And the other element of the other case you talked about, Robert Jenrick. I mean, that is straightforward buying influence, being at a fundraiser, offering some cash, not very much cash, and trying to save £40 million off a tax bill for development. I read through all of the documents that came out after the Jenrick scandal, and it's absolutely clear that the civil servants were aghast at the idea that Robert Jenrick should try to use his powers as a planning minister so irrationally, which is why he lost the court case in the end.
But this isn't a problem exclusively for the current party in government. Scandals in lobbying have existed throughout time on both sides of the House. Do you think the problem here is, as a nation, we haven't gone down the American route and we haven't actually regulated this enough, and it's about time that we do that?
No, I think we have regulated it pretty fairly. As I said, what should happen is that if a former prime minister or a minister becomes an in-house lobbyist, that should be that should be regulated. That should have to be registered. That's the loophole that David Cameron was exploiting, and that's the thing that's caused the most egregious recent scandal. I think by and large our politics are pretty clean. I don't think there are many politicians who abuse the position that they have, or many former special advisors. Most people happily go through the process of clearing their appointments, waiting their time. But I think it's the fact that we are quite well regulated, that these few examples like Cameron and Greensill, Jenrick, and the development in the Isle of Dogs, they jump out because by and large we've managed to separate money from politics. Although it is interesting that the scale of the money from developers that's currently coming into politics in the UK, mainly to the governing party, the Conservative Party, because that's an area where you see all around the world getting a planning permission is a fast track to making a profit. So people are willing to spend the money to, as Mirko said, to sit at the table, to influence the agenda, to influence the thinking of the politicians.
And what about party donations? Because this often throws up a few issues or contradictions or conflicts of interest on both sides. I mean, this has happened to Labour MPs quite recently. Should there be some sort of regulation or a tightening of regulation around that? So there's not this sort of drip, 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 I scratch your back, you scratch mine, I give the party money, I put money into your campaign, and then in return down the line, I'm going to expect you to do something for me.
Well, it's David Cameron, wasn't it, who said that sunshine is the best disinfectant. A lot more transparency about who meets politicians in party contexts would change the calculation about whether you want to donate money to a party in a way that might get you access to a minister, which might get a decision made along the lines that you wanted to. So that's an area where parties could be more transparent, and I think the idea that you give so much money to the Tory party and you get close access to senior leading cabinet ministers, and that has nothing to do and no effect on policy. It would be better if people were straightforward. The people who you meet and who you discuss issues with do have an influence on you. It's actually not wrong to have people around you who work in business at the highest level who can discuss an issue in great detail. It could be that it's, you need experts from the pensions industry, the insurance industry, to tell you about some of the big financing decisions that we have facing the country. So it's the opaqueness of it, the nature of the black box, which raises suspicions. And then when you get a case like Jenrick or a case like Cameron, people go, well, it must all be dodgy. Well, it isn't all dodgy. So the more openness there is, the better.
In terms of that, I mean, you've operated at the highest level. Paint a picture, please, for the viewers of what it's like when the lobbyists come knocking. Is it a case of, this chap from this particular industry wants to book an appointment with a minister or junior minister and ends up sitting with their SPAD and notes are taken and that's it, diary's closed, thank you very much for your input? Or is it more about going to that lovely Michel Roux restaurant on Parliament Square and having a few bottles of wine and a few sort of nudge, nudge, wink, wink, whisper, whisper conversations?
Well, most people in 21st century politics don't have the time for two-bottle lunches. More's the pity, one might say, but that's the nature of politics, being fast-moving, the 24/7, always on media, the always on social media. You actually have very business-like conversations, and the truth is, people who waste your time don't get to see you a second time. People who actually bring you information, an angle, and it could be they come from an environmental NGO, and it could be they come from the Square Mile, or it could be they're a startup who are seeing blockages to their development of something innovative. It could be a tech startup, it could be a bioscience startup. By and large, the best informed ministers make the best decisions. So I would always try and bring people who could give information and insight to my boss into a meeting, and if they couldn't meet my boss, they could meet me, and that insight could get prevented. But everybody knows that you've got to have a case to make a case. People who don't have a case, they get your time, but if they waste your time, they've probably done more damage to themselves and their cause than if they'd never met you in the first place. So it's a very it's like any social or business encounter, which is everybody will take a meeting with you. And if it's a bad meeting, you always remember bad meetings, don't you? So that probably does a lot worse for your client than a good meeting.
You've just heard from political strategist and former political advisor to the Labour Party, John McTernan. After the break, I'm continuing this conversation with former Conservative MP Ian Twyn. See you in a couple of minutes.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else. I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GB News.
Join us for Political Correction. We're here every Sunday to correct politics and put you, the people, back in charge.
We talk about all areas of the United Kingdom, including Northern Ireland.
Our debate goes way beyond the Westminster Village. It's about the real country. It's about your opinion. So please, we want you to tell us what you think.
This is Political Correction.
Every Sunday morning from 10 a.m. here on GB News.
Hi, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
And we're hosting a show right here on GB News, 9:30am till 12pm, every single weekday, called to the point.
We're going to be talking about all the big issues that matter to you at home in Britain.
Absolutely, whether it's holding politicians to account, discussing what's taking place in the Channel, banging on about law and order, we're not afraid to do the absolute lot of it.
Yes, and if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we'll be saying it.
Make sure you're here 9:30am till 12pm, every single weekday, right here on GB News, for To The Point.
I'm Mark Dolan. Join me live from 9 p.m. to midnight every Friday, Saturday and Sunday. Your weekend starts here. My show exists to do three things: to inform, to debate and to entertain. Big guests, big stories and big opinions. And I can't do any of it without you. It's lively and it's a little bit funny. So join me from 9 p.m. to midnight every Friday, Saturday and Sunday on GB News.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Nepotism, chummery and cronyism exist in all industries. Try as you may, the "it's who you know, not what you know" mantra will always exist. Yet when it comes to those whose hands are on the tiller of the good ship Great Britain, what then? When the influence percolates down to decisions that affect all of us and our country's future. Golden handshakes, brown envelopes, secret WhatsApps and dodgy donations. Politics has been suffused with scandals since time immemorial. I doubt a single nation could be declared corruption-free. But when it comes to our own moral compass, are we a driving force for good, or are we on the back seat of the bus with the bad boys? Well, let's restart this debate by speaking to Ian Twin, a former Conservative MP who now works in lobbying. Ian, thank you so much for coming in. Demystify this industry a bit for us. I mean, is it a case of lots of whining and dining and I scratch your back, you scratch mine? Or is it actually a rather corporate and dull experience of many meetings and note-taking and...
Well, it's a bit of each, but it's not whining and dining anymore. And that's very old school. When I was a Member of Parliament in the 80s and 90s, whining and dining went on all the time. I've spent nearly 20 years in the advertising industry as Public Affairs Director. I'm retired now, I should say, so anything I say is me. And that declined. And did it become corporate and boring? No, I don't think so, because essentially what we're doing is you're saying, we've got some ideas about what the law should be or how the law should operate, and we want civil servants or ministers or members of parliament to understand what the impact, in this case it would have been on advertising, but it could have been on anything. It might have been on animal welfare if I worked for an NGO. And in all my experience, both in Brussels and in Westminster, it's about the need for ministers to have information, alternative information.
Are the cultures different between Brussels and Westminster? That's what personally fascinates me, because I sat as an MEP in the European Parliament, albeit relatively briefly. And I think also I didn't get my door knocked as often as perhaps some of the others because, well, I wanted out. I didn't believe in the system, so why would you come to me and ask me to help change laws? But my impression of the culture there was very much whining and dining and events and, you know, a huge raft of corporate lobbyists with lots of backroom deals with unelected commissioners. My experience of the environment there wasn't necessarily a positive one.
Well, it was interesting. I mean, I'm obviously, from the advertising industry point of view, I had my input. I was also a Conservative MEP for 1 year when Lord Bethell retired, and I took the rest of his mandate, and I took some legislation through, so I was lobbied. And it was all useful stuff. In fact, a lot of the stuff people were lobbying on was stuff that I eventually turned into amendments because I didn't like what the Commission had produced. And so we were able to talk it through and get changes done. And that was really helpful to me, sitting there, being responsible for taking amendments through European Parliament. My experience of European Parliament, I mean, I agree with the whining and dining. It's a little bit closed shop. You're either in Strasbourg or you're in Brussels, you're away from home. And there is whining and dining that does go on, although not in my experience, very much of it. But there we are, that's life. It seemed to be a very open environment. So if talking about the advertising industry and consumer affairs, for instance, if I had something to say, then Commission officials and MEPs would be willing to see me. But if I went in and just wanted to blag it, giving us a straight party line without any useful information, I don't think I'd be seen again. So there's a harsh judgment made.
Yeah, in terms of big business and the influence that big business has on various legislatures, be it formerly in the EU when we were part of it and now in the UK. I mean, especially, we're going to be doing a programme tomorrow looking at the big food industry, which has an enormous amount of influence. Do you think that sometimes big business has too much say over the laws that are written, that the lobbyists perhaps have a little bit too much influence?
No, I don't. I mean, I think that's for ministers and civil servants to say, no, this is our government policy and this is what we're going to stick to. But, for instance, if it were the food industry, they know more about what the direct effect is going to be on their industry, therefore on jobs and on the economy. So ministers and civil servants need to know that. It's up to ministers and civil servants to accept it or reject that advice, but to cut yourself off from it means you are going to make mistakes.
Have you encountered any nefarious acts or slightly dodgy behaviours during your entire career?
No one's given me a brown envelope, sadly. Well, they're giving me a brown envelope with lots and lots of paper in it, but unfortunately not legal currency. They're giving you information you might want to read. Honestly, I think it's relatively clean. I think there is an issue, and that is that registered lobbyists through lobbying firms have to register and say who they're seeing. But NGOs, law firms in the city, who have a lot of lobbyists within them, don't have to register. Now, I think, and accountancy firms too are doing it as well now. So I think there does need to be a lot more transparency. We do need to change the rules so that we've got everyone who wants to see a minister or senior civil servants about policy have to say they are doing it.
There's also these instances of what's known as astroturfing, where one particular organisation might not lobby directly, but lobbies another organisation almost as a sort of cover, and then that organisation takes the issue forward. Does that sort of wheeler dealing almost of influence concern you, or is that just, realpolitik?
Well, the only way I could see that in my own experience happening would be where businesses talk directly to trade associations and representative bodies who then front up their point of view. And I think that's quite reasonable, because then the representative bodies are, and for instance, my own, which is in the advertising industry, was talking on behalf of all advertisers, not just one specific one. It's probably healthier that there's a common agreement about what would be best for the industry. What's going to happen if ads are banned on food and drink? Might be interesting tomorrow. What is going to happen to the food and drink industry and the media industry if the government go ahead with heavy-handed banning?
But when you have competing interests, I mean, big food is often under fire for things such as the salt and the sugar in their products. And, we've just
but
had
who are they being fired at by?
Well, it's essentially health bodies.
No,
health
it's
boards.
NGOs. It's pressure groups.
But
people
who
raise money to lobby.
Yeah, but people who are representing the interests of the nation's health, by
that's
and large.
what they say. That's a claim, but they are pressure groups.
And
a lot of them do have sensible things to say. But they're not good of their own right. And they don't have to register their interests.
And do you think that if just a little bit of tightening up, a little bit of sorting a few things out, improving that register, that's enough? And if we do that, we've got this right. We're a transparent government, we are a non-corrupt government, and the general public can have utmost trust in operations in Whitehall.
I think that's right, but one always has to keep an open eye. If things do go wrong, then there has to be a clampdown on the individuals where it's gone wrong, on both sides.
You've been on both sides of this fence, which I find remarkable. It's quite common, actually.
Yeah,
I think for politicians, the famous revolving door.
In the area as well, before all that.
But what about things like party donations? What about when you have those fundraiser events and, you know, a businessman happens to be sitting next to someone who would be quite handy for them to have a conversation with? Or what about people who say, you know, Ian, we'd love to see you re-elected. We want to donate to your campaign to do that. What sort of crossing of T's and dotting of I's do you have to do to make sure that you come out smelling of roses?
You do have to now come out smelling of roses. I think there was a time when money did pass hands, and that was very useful, but it depended. It was always going to come out in the end. I remember being called to order once in the House of Commons because I was speaking on behalf of the Lighting Industry Federation, because I was co-chairman with a Labour MP of the all-party Lighting Industries Group. But I had Thorn EMI in my constituency, and they called me out because we had a researcher attached to us. But yeah, it was a fair point to make, I thought. And yeah, I had to apologise to the House that I hadn't been clear that that was the case. So, yeah, we do need to be looked at. There shouldn't be any easy rides.
Quite. Ian, thank you so much for coming in and essentially reassuring the nation that we're not doing a bad job.
Not bad.
We're not a bad country.
Not all people are bad.
It's been lovely talking to you, Ian. Thank you ever so much. Ian Twin there, former Conservative MP, and moved on to work in public affairs. Now, Mark Bukowski, a PR consultant and strategist, is here to tell us what he thinks about lobbying. Now, you've been involved in lobbying. Is it transparent enough, or is there misuse of the system?
Of course, there's misuse of the system. I listened to what Ian said, and by and large, he's correct that the majority, of what you call the grassroots lobbying, or informing, giving information, giving counter views, particularly, I suspect the money being spent currently on the food debate is significant. Down the years, we have seen, major journalistic endeavours to expose things like, the Bernie Ecclestone sort of scandal. I mean, cash in brown envelopes around, the Hamiltons. Those things are, are sort of bonded in time. The question is that on the whole, one suspects there is greater transparency than ever before, and particularly with social media. Recently, David Cameron's efforts have made the news, and a significant amount of money, passed hands, to him for his shares in Greensill. So wherever interests of big industry, big corporate factors, big lobbyists, who can also help in terms of sort of donations to political parties, no matter whatever the hue, you are going to use that influence in some way to get your point across. And the issue is it's the scale, of lobbyist power when you've got big legal entities behind you, major accountants, all the professional services that get involved with public affairs. That's where things, go awry, because they have the power and they have the influence. The idea that there is no whining and dining is delusion in my effect. It might not actually happen in the Houses of Parliament, and access, to those professionals who've got access to Parliament has been curbed. But there's loads of events that happen around the country, from cultural events to sporting events, where people are invited, sitting in boxes. I've seen, sort of cricket, football, rock and roll, all being used to actually get someone into a room to have a word in their ear, to influence them. So it is a murky world. It is a complicated world on the on the whole, people, have a lot to lose if they're exposed. But I think that, the sleaze that we've seen recently does have an effect, that people have had enough. And they clearly see that there are noses in the trough. And I think the regulation that has happened, over the years has cleaned a lot of it up. But where there are big corporate interests, there will always be somebody with a fee who can afford some very, very powerful professional firms to represent their interests.
Now, talking about these powerful professionals, it happens quite often that a lot of those have been inherently involved in politics, which is no surprise. You will have the contacts, you've got the know-how. And currently there's a 2-year cooling off period. If you've worked in politics and then you want to enter into lobbying, there's 2 years that you have to wait before you can do that. And the money involved in this can be astronomical, especially if you happen to be something like a former Prime Minister. Should we have a system where actually, if you've been deeply engaged in politics, there should be a longer cooling off period? Or should it be that we try and flush out nepotism altogether and say, do you know what, lobbying should be done by professionals in an industry who are objective and who haven't got mates in the party and who haven't got private telephone numbers?
Well, I in theory, correct. That's an egalitarian view of it and probably correct, but I don't think you can regulate that easily. Yes, perhaps that's how it should be. It's never going to be the sense, because if you have been in politics, if you've been in Westminster, you go up to the Lords, or you've got to earn an income outside of politics. When you're back on the street, when the voters have sort of kicked you out, what do you do? And if you've had a lot of power in politics, then people are going to be interested in your influence and your ability to reach people. It's networking. And everybody thus. I don't think you'll ever eradicate that. You could have longer cooling off period. What does that say? Does that say a group of individuals that you were connected to while you were in power are going to be out of a job or are going to move on, and therefore your network is going to be weaker? I doubt it. People learn a lot from the sort of the corridors of Westminster and can be incredibly useful. And yes, it is important that all views are got across. But whenever you see small people, little people who have a cause and want to affect change, it's very difficult. If you look at Hillsborough, if you look at the Lloyds banking scandal at the moment, it's very difficult for people to see justice or get justice made, because there'll be yet another process thrown in to obfuscate and maybe throw the issues into the long grass. And there has to be a incredible determination. So therefore, the professionals who get paid for money to do this, or are trained to do this, are always going to win out against the sort of DIY amateurs who are passionate and committed to a cause for change. So it's incredibly difficult to navigate. And, I feel sometimes when you see these huge bodies that are matched against the small individual with a case, and they're going to get squashed. And lobbying within Parliament, will always be a nefarious case. And I think there's some very smart people who probably will run rings around the rules. But the good news is that the strength of the media, and particularly social media now, has a voice, and that voice can expose any form of corruption, and that's a very powerful thing.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of 2 wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else. I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GBNews.
Join us for Political Correction. We're here every Sunday to correct politics and put you, the people, back in charge.
We talk about all areas of the United Kingdom, including Northern Ireland.
Our debate goes way beyond the Westminster Village. It's about the real country. It's about your opinion. So please, we want you to tell us what you think.
This is the Political Correction.
Every Sunday morning from 10 a.m. here on GBNews.
Hi, I'm Patrick Christie's.
And I'm Mercy Moroki.
And we're hosting a show right here on GB News, 9:30am till 12pm, every single weekday, called to the point.
We're going to be talking about all the big issues that matter to you at home in Britain.
Absolutely, whether it's holding politicians to account, discussing what's taking place in the channel, banging on about law and order, we're not afraid to do the absolute lot of it.
Yes, and if you're thinking it, you can guarantee that we'll be saying it.
Make sure you're here 9:30am till 12pm, every single weekday, right here on GB News, for To The Point.
Political commentator Connor Tomlinson also joins me in the studio this afternoon. It sometimes feels a little bit like them versus us, doesn't it? Those who've got the connections, those who have power, able to make huge sums of money. And when things go wrong, it creates a bit of an ugly scene, like the Cameron Greensill scandal.
Yeah, it feels very much like the Etonian Boys Club are using their connections to get a leg up and stash all the monopoly money for themselves, as you put it. Now, obviously, there's a distinction between the NGOs, who really need to put forward a point of view and inform all of the MPs and whatnot on these issues when it comes to election time and Commons floor debate. So, as much as we need to registration, I know prior guest was talking about that quite a lot, there are quite a lot of hoops to jump through presently. I know, working with a couple of NGOs, how difficult it is to get past the Charity Commission, for example. But there's a pretty big distinction when voters are looking at how the politicians behave. And as much as your prior guest said we can't regulate those conversations, I know John Penrose talks a lot about so if you have a conversation about a particular lobbying issue with a senior civil servant or an MP, that has to go on record, because presently they aren't. And there's a lot of ex-MPs, for example, still using their parliamentary passes to go into Parliament, have conversations by the back door, using them up to 100 times a year, and we don't know what they're talking about. So even though you've got that 2-year gap, they can walk into Parliament the day after they're out of office and talk to one of their mates about what should be done.
So the picture isn't as clean and pretty as perhaps we'd like. I mean, do you think, by and large, in this country, we're getting this right? Our regulation is a lot thinner than that in America. We have had a number of emerging conflicts of interest or embarrassments, peccadillos, scandals, whatever you want to call them, in recent months even, and particularly during the pandemic, when legislation perhaps had to be rushed through and decisions had to be made and contracts awarded and perhaps due process wasn't taken. Do you think overall we handle this pretty well and the general public can sit back and think, I have confidence in my government and the processes, or are there lessons to be learned?
Well, I don't think the general public presently has confidence at all. I mean, if you look at YouGov, and the situation behind YouGov is quite interesting, because obviously the vaccine minister set that up, and then people wonder why every single poll relating to the lockdown, they're very positive. But if you look at the YouGov polls on it shortly after the Greensill scandal, 60% of people, and this was cross-party, there's about a 10% gap, but that's still 60% of the Tories, said they shouldn't be doing anything like this. Cameron, Boris getting these holidays and the flat renovations, technically if they're not breaking ministerial code, that they won't be on the hook for it, but there's still something morally, there's a gut discomfort with the voter base, and politicians should be very careful about that. And there's also the issue of, as you said, we've let the rules be a little bit lax during crisis scenarios. I know Matt Hancock was on the hook for his undisclosed billions of COVID contracts, and essentially waved that away and said, oh, there's not much of a legal challenge here, because that was pretty much the practice that things were sloppy because we were in a crisis scenario. The issue is, if you say we can be lax with the rules during a crisis scenario, people are going to claim crisis scenarios all the time.
Have we got a particular problem perhaps now with this government? You're talking about old Etonians and the same sort of people in these networks earning money, getting contracts, scratching each other's backs. Or is this sort of thing, I mean, it's natural, isn't it, in life, that if you know someone, you pick up the phone to them. I mean, I frankly do it quite often. Sometimes when I'm thinking about the guests I want on this programme, I'll think, oh, I know such and such would be a great speaker on this, and I might send them a text message. That's how life works.
Yes, but the issue is if you're trying to secure taxpayer funds, particularly, as with the Greensill example, you have a monopoly on the state has a monopoly on force in that scenario, and they have access to things we don't have, and seemingly they're insulated from consequence as well. And well, not everyone thinks that, because clearly Rishi Sunak didn't decide to pick up David Cameron's phone and go along with it. He seemed very aware of the optics of the situation. And as much as your prior guest was saying there's no whining and dining, when David Cameron literally sets up a drink with Matt Hancock, Rishi Sunak and Lex Greensill, I would say that classifies as whining and dining, personally.
Indeed. Well, Conor, thank you for coming in and giving us your thoughts and your commentary on this. Very, very valuable insight. I really appreciate it. Now time for the final word today. I've been asking, is UK politics transparent enough? Loads of you have been having your say. On the emails, Larry says, I think all MPs are so-called career politicians doing it to earn a living and not as a vocation. Should we be surprised that their heads are turned for even more money at any means? I'm 76 and losing my faith and trust in the people who are representing us in Parliament. Joan says, I think politicians make a lot of noise and promises, then those civil servants in the various departments ignore them and carry on as usual. Steph says, in no way, shape or form does she trust politics. From party donors to lobbyists to MPs to ministers to the civil service, none of it is transparent. I must admit, during the course of the show, I feel like I've been slightly reassured that it may not be as bad as we think. But now here to give their take, it's the final word with Michelle Dewberry, Colin Brazier and Nigel Farage. Now, Nigel, makes sense to start with you. You've sat as an MEP over in Brussels and spoken quite a lot on the sheer bulk of corporate lobbyists over there. Do you think we have an issue with lobbying in this country, or do you think actually we're an example to perhaps follow?
So the lobby in this country is minute because for the best part of half a century, most of the laws that affect our businesses, nearly 80% of the laws that affect our businesses weren't made in the UK Parliament, they were made in Brussels. So we've got an embryonic lobbying industry in this country, but it's about to explode because Brexit gives us the opportunity to make decisions about agriculture, fisheries, or whatever else, financial services, whatever else it may be. So if there was a moment to try and set some decent rules for lobbying, it's now. I was in the European Parliament for 21 years. I could not believe the sheer scale of a lobby, up to 15,000 lobbyists in Brussels. And you literally, if you'd wanted, could have gone out to lunch, breakfast, dinner, champagne receptions every single day. By the way, I never did. I never, ever accepted anything from them. But I saw them wandering through the corridors of Brussels, and they were, without doubt, a very deeply corrupting influence on the whole process. Now, there is an argument that if a law is proposed that affects an industry, that industry needs to say, whoa, hang on a second, you haven't thought through what the consequences of this are. So I'm not saying that industry representation isn't right, isn't proper, but I think what we've seen through the David Cameron affair is the danger of not having a proper register for lobbying interests and for not having some rules. Back in the 1980s, we were talking about former cabinet ministers not going to work, immediately for commercial companies. So I think the politician turning lobbyist very quickly, that we can put a stop to. More generally, I think there needs to be a proper register of lobbyist interests. It's not there, but if we're ever going to do it, let's use this moment of Brexit to try and get it right.
Now, Colin, you've been a journalist for a while now. You must have covered a number of the scandals that have emerged over the years. Do you think that things have gotten better? Do you think that politically we're cleaning our act up? Or do you think there's something about politics inherently that just invites scandal?
Alex, I think there's a moral panic about this. I'm a bit more relaxed about it than I think Nigel is. I do agree, however, and I have a concern particularly about what's happening in local government. The golden age of local government is over, but there's a lot of talk of it returning and a lot more subsidiarity of giving power to local authorities. Now, the problem with that isn't per se with local government, it's more with the fact we just don't have the means of invigilating and the oversight that we used to have that used to be provided by local media, local newspapers, where I started out my career in journalism, papers like the Yorkshire Post, all those wonderful local newspapers which now struggle. The other thing I would say, and it's not necessarily a very popular message, but I think it's true, is that I'm not too worried about being taken for breakfast, MPs or dinner or whatever it is. A lot of these people are going to mix together. They're often drawn from the same gene pool when it comes to the social dimension to all this. But I do worry that when it becomes more serious, the brown paper envelopes and all the rest of it. And one of the best ways, I think, of insulating MPs from that kind of temptation is to pay them more than we currently give them. That's not a popular message, but, you know, there's Nigel talking about what was happening in Brussels. Compared to many of our European counterparts, our MPs are not particularly well paid. A lot of them actually have taken a pay cut to go into frontline politics in Westminster. Pay them a bit more, put temptation out of the way.
Michelle, I mean, just before I speak to you, Michelle, the poll results are in. 86% of you do not think politics is transparent enough. So that's a bit of a damning message there from the general public. Michelle, do you agree with that? Do you trust politics? Do you think our system is transparent enough? Or do you think that there's a lot more sleaze than we know about?
Well, I think it's absolutely not transparent enough. And David Cameron said that sunlight is the best disinfectant. Well, yes, it is. So I think what we need to do is take him at his own words, get some sunlight shining in and do a proper review of what is happening and what isn't happening. Nigel mentions there that he says it's perhaps minute, but I would say, how do we know? I think often to try and find out what's even going on, you have to spend so much time doing things like freedom of information requests, etc. The information is not readily and freely available. It's too opaque, and that's wrong. What Colin mentions about paying the MPs more, I don't even agree with that, because I think often what's happening, it might be people making donations, for example, because they want a policy to change. Paying an MP more wouldn't make that happen. So we need the transparency, we need the data to be more visible and more easily accessible as well.
Now, we're just coming out, well, still sort of in a pandemic, but coming out of the worst of it at least. Now, at some of the most peak moments during lockdowns, during that process, especially at the start of this pandemic, decisions were taken very quickly, contracts awarded very quickly. It just so happened a lot of those contracts happened to go to people known to those in positions of power. Do you think that's forgivable, considering it's a crisis, or do you think that actually the rules should not have been circumvented if they were, under any circumstances?
Well, I think it's understandable. Whether or not it's forgivable remains to be seen, because what needs to happen is a full investigation needs to be conducted to look at what happened, why and when. And if it can be the situation that actually we desperately needed to get our hands on PPE and my friend Nigel to the left of me, because I know him, he could deliver that quicker than anyone else. Well, if indeed he could deliver it quicker than anyone else, well, fair enough. Actually, if he could have delivered it twice, I don't know, much slower than Colin over there, who just happens to be in the supply chain, and double the cost, well then no, that's not acceptable nor forgivable. So again, it depends on the data and what that shows once an independent investigation has been conducted.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating landscape. I started off this programme quite pessimistic about the nature of our politics, and some guests might have been able to change my mind a bit. But before I say goodbye to you all, you three, do you trust our political system? Colin?
Yeah, I mean, Winston Churchill was right, wasn't he, when he said democracy is the worst form of government apart from all the others that have ever been tried. What else are we going to do?
Nigel?
Brexit is the rebirth of democracy. We're going to start making laws for all the big areas of our lives. We've got a real chance to prove ourselves here, but we've got to get some basic rules in place.
And Michelle?
Do I always trust the framework? No, I don't. And often I don't trust the people fully that's within it as well. So I would like to see a lot more sunlight, to quote one David Cameron.
I'm Alex Phillips, and you've been watching We Need to Talk About. And for the last hour, we've been talking about lobbying. That's it for today. See you next time.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else. I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GBNews.
Join us for Political Correction. We're here every Sunday to correct politics and put you, the people, back in charge.
We talk about all areas